What's going on, people? Hope you're having a good night or day. Today I wanted to take a moment to talk about some of the new changes introduced in this open beta. I've been getting a lot of questions in specific about the build known as the Paladin build. This is something we played with extensively during the closed beta and ended up making a video on for people who specialize in sword and shield and the life staff. With the release of the open beta, we got ourselves some patch notes that consisted of mostly balance changes, but also fixing for bugs as well. In these changes, we did get various updates for multiple systems related to attributes, healing, armor, perks, and the scaling of the Amber Gem. And all of this combined had led a lot of people to believe that the Paladin build was completely dead. Well, I'm here to break it down piece by piece and tell you why the Paladin build should still be just fine. At least those that utilize a sword and shield for their main weapon at least. So let's start with the attribute threshold changes. They reduced the constitution bonus that kicks in once you pass 250 constitution, where you would have normally received an 80% damage reduction when at full health, but now that's been reduced to 60. There's also a 60-second cooldown on this, so it won't be happening at a constant rate. This doesn't really affect paladins specifically as much as tanks as a whole, but it's still something to take note of. And for 150 constitution bonus, this should now only reduce damage from critical hits and not all hits entirely. The next thing is that Sacred Protection. This used to give a baseline health increase to everybody in your party, but now it can be used to grant an increase to incoming healing efficiency to all party members. I haven't fully tested it yet, but I wouldn't really classify it as a real nerf since the paladins can actually make use of this. Since the bonus will probably apply for us too like the previous one did, that's just more incoming healing for us to make use of. Now they did reduce the effectiveness of the Orb of Protection's Fortify from 15% to 10%, but that's not really that big of a deal since we normally get a lot of Fortify and incoming damage resistance off of Sword and Shield, Life Staff, and perks altogether. And Clampeting does go into effect at 50% Fortify, so we won't be able to stack up past that regardless. But then we have the equipment load changes. So what happened here is they reduced the overall healing efficiency by 20% and added that same amount as bonus onto the light armor threshold to allow pure healers to specialize more effectively. So now wearing primarily light armor is the way to go for putting out the most healing. And this is the main thing that caused people to assume that the Paladin build was no longer viable. However, during the closed beta, close to end game and even around the time we reached mid game, we were already starting to heal for a crazy good amount. And a 20% nerf isn't going to in any way completely destroy this build. Now I will talk about how they could destroy the build if they wanted to, but the current state of it you don't have to worry about too much. Early game, the Paladin tank is much weaker because you will feel that 20% in the early stages, but around the time you start doing the Amarine Expedition and get your faction gear at level 25, that's when you'll start to see the gains again. Now for those of you that use this build with the Great Axe or Warhammer, that portion of the Paladin is certainly going to be less effective than before. One of the last things they did that affects this is reduce the damage scaling of the Amber Gem by 20%. They also made a couple perk changes like the Fortified Recovery, Keenly Fortified, and Mortification are now reduced from 30% to 10%, but the main perk we would want to keep an eye out for anyway would be Blessed, which we would normally find on pretty decent life staffs. But the Amber Gem nerf, yeah, that's probably going to deter a lot of people from specializing into the DPS side of it. However, as a Paladin tank, which is the build myself and many people did use, we don't have to care nearly as much about the damage output as much as the damage mitigation and healing efficiency. And also, towards the end of the closed beta, I found a very good sword that I would highly recommend keeping an eye out for. It had one of the chain element perks, which meant that I couldn't socket an Amber Gem into it anyway, but I was able to use this sword for all forms of content, and it did let me still socket a Carnelian Gem. Now they did nerf the chain element perks too, so overall you'll probably just want to get two different swords for different content anyway, but having that chain element perk on the Carnelian Gem sword might help you a little bit. But also look out for the hated perk for increased threat generation, and lifesteal or mortal lifesteal for that extra juice to add on. And lastly, if they did want to completely shred this Paladin build like I said before, all they would really need to do is make it so Sacred Ground, Beacon, and Orb of Protection completely disappear as soon as we switch to another weapon. If they did that, then it would be goodbye Paladin, and at that point they might as well also remove the Nomad gear from the lineup, because at that point there would be no use for it unless the one-handed mace ended up being a real Paladin weapon in the future, which I do still hope does become a thing. But with that, thank you all very much for watching. That's all the info you need to know for now, and farewell.